We are so incredibly happy to have you here listening to our stories, and we truly hope you enjoy every moment spent in this world we've built for you. Our community thrives on your presence, and we would love to get to know you better as we begin this journey. Where are you watching from? Write it in the comments below so we can celebrate the global reach of these timeless tales. Now, let us step back into the fog of the past, where the steady rhythm of a mechanical heart begins to beat. In the heart of a soot-stained industrial town, where the sun often struggled to pierce through the veil of coal smoke, Samuel lived a life measured not by the rising sun, but by the rhythmic pulse of brass and steel. His shop was a sanctuary of mechanical size, a place where the air smelled of linseed oil and aged parchment, insulating him from a world that moved far too fast for his quiet soul. He moved with a practiced grace, his fingers long and calloused, possessing a delicacy that belied his years of labor amongst the gears. Every morning followed a precise routine, a dance of winding keys and oiling pivots that kept the chaos of the outside world at bay. It was a life of profound solitude, yet he never felt truly alone while the heartbeat of 100 clocks filled the silence of his workshop. There is a particular kind of peace found in the predictable, a comfort in knowing that if one applies exactly the right pressure, the metal will yield and the movement will begin. Samuel found his identity in the steady ticking, believing that time was the only constant in a universe that seemed determined to unravel at the seams. He rarely spoke to the townspeople, preferring the honest language of a well-made escapement to the fickle nature of human conversation. His patience was legendary, a quiet strength that allowed him to sit for hours over a single hairspring until it vibrated with the perfection of a living thing. Who among us has not, at some point, wished to retreat into a world of our own making, where every gear fits and every second is accounted for? The town regarded him as a ghost in a glass case, a man who had traded the warmth of companionship for the cold precision of his craft. Yet, within that silence, there was a hidden depth, a library of memories stored in the slow rotation of the hands he so meticulously set. He watched the seasons change through the dusty window of his shop, seeing the world grow louder and more demanding while he remained anchored in his devotion to the craft. His solitude was not a prison, but a chosen fortress, a way to protect the embers of a heart that had perhaps felt too much in a younger, more turbulent life. It is a curious human trait to mistake a man's quietude for a lack of passion, when often the deepest fires burn in the hearths we keep most hidden. As the shadows lengthened across his workbench, Samuel often wondered if he had become a part of the machinery himself, a cog in a grander design he could no longer perceive. He found beauty in the mundane, in the way a shadow fell across a copper dial or the specific click of a latch engaging at the stroke of midnight. There was a dignity in his isolation, a refusal to be swept away by the frantic pace of the new age that hammered at the town's iron gates. He was the guardian of the interval, the man who understood that a second could be an eternity if one only knew how to look at it closely enough. He believed he had mastered the art of being forgotten, unaware that the very tools of his silence were about to become the instruments of a grand revelation. The clocks continued their tireless vigil, a symphony of ticking that served as the soundtrack to his lonely existence, till the repetition became a form of prayer. He moved through the dimly lit room, his presence a mere whisper against the mechanical roar of his creations, finding a strange solace in the fact that time waited for no one, not even its master. Even the most resolute silence, however, is eventually broken by the intrusion of a persistent truth seeking a way into the light. He reached for a heavy silver pocket watch, its casing cool against his palm, and felt a strange vibration that did not belong to the spring. A faint sound, like a rhythmic tapping against the door, signaled that the world he had worked so hard to exclude was finally coming to claim its due. Eleanor arrived in the town like a sudden gust of wind through a stale room, her presence a sharp contrast to the gray uniformity of the industrial landscape. As the daughter of the new magistrate, she was expected to be a decorative addition to his household. Yet her mind was a restless engine of curiosity and sharp intellect. She possessed an uncanny power of observation, noticing the way the town's elite whispered in corners and how the gears of local power ground against the needs of the poor. Her father's house was filled with the heavy furniture of authority, but she found more interest in the small, neglected details of the streets. It was her sharp eye that first led her to the unassuming clock shop, drawn by a sense that something far more complex than time was being manufactured behind its darkened windows. Upon entering the shop, she did not see a lonely old man. She saw a master of a hidden language, his every movement a testament to a connection she had never witnessed before. She watched Samuel work, noting the subtle flick of his wrist and the way his eyes softened when a mechanism finally caught its rhythm. There was a spark of recognition between them, not of romance, but of two minds that operated on a frequency different from the rest of the world. She began to frequent the shop under the guise of needing repairs, her questions always lingering a second longer than necessary, testing the boundaries of his practiced reserve. How often do we walk past the very thing we are searching for, simply because it refuses to shout its name? Her intellect was a double-edged sword, providing her with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore the inconsistencies in her father's ledgers and the town's shifting politics. She noticed that the clocks Samuel sold to the town's high officials were different, not in their appearance, but in the subtle, erratic pulses of their movements. Her connection to the clockmaker grew with every visit, a silent understanding forming in the spaces between their few spoken words. She saw the weariness in his shoulders and the hidden brilliance in his gaze, sensing that he was a man who held a secret too heavy for one person to carry alone. It was a classic human folly to assume that a daughter is merely an extension of her father's will, when she is often his most observant critic. Eleanor began to spend her evenings sketching the patterns she saw in the clocks, her mind racing to find the logic behind the seemingly random skips in the ticking. She felt a growing urgency, a realization that the peace of the town was a fragile mask for something much darker and more calculated. Her observation of Samuel became an obsession of sorts, a desire to understand why a man of such talent would choose to hide himself away in a world of gears. She felt the weight of her own social position, a gilded cage that limited her movements but allowed her to see the inner workings of the magistrate's power. The mystery of the clocks was becoming a mirror of her own life, a complex arrangement of parts that looked perfect on the outside but harbored a hidden tension within. The air in the shop seemed to thicken with every visit, the ticking of the clocks transforming from a comforting hum into a countdown she couldn't yet define. She caught Samuel watching her once, a look of profound sorrow and warning in his eyes that chilled her more than the winter air outside. She realized then that her curiosity was not just a pastime, but a path toward a truth that might shatter the very foundation of her world. She felt the first stirrings of a bond that went beyond mere friendship, a shared burden of knowledge that linked her fate to the man of time. As she turned to leave the shop one evening, she noticed a small engraved code on the underside of a pendulum, a discovery that would change the nature of her quest forever. If you are finding yourself drawn into the ticking heart of this mystery, please subscribe, like guitars, and share if you want more stories like this. Your support allows us to keep the gears of our storytelling turning, bringing more tales of intrigue and emotion to your screen. The town was a web of secrets, and every clock was a knot in the thread, holding together a conspiracy that Eleanor was only beginning to unravel. She returned to the shop with a new perspective, her eyes searching for the hidden code she knew was buried within the brass and silver. The truth was not written in ink, but in the intervals between the ticks, a language of silence that Samuel had used to document the corruption of the men who ruled them. She realized that each clock was a message, a carefully constructed piece of evidence that whispered of bribery, stolen land, and the cold calculations of power. The conspiracy reached the highest levels of the magistracy, involving men who used time as a weapon to control the lives of the workers in the factories. Samuel had been their unwilling accomplice, forced to create these speaking clocks as a way for the elite to communicate without ever leaving a paper trail. The risk was immense, for if the code were discovered, the very machines that kept the town running would become the instruments of their destruction. Can truth ever truly be hidden? Or does it eventually find a way to vibrate through even the most solid of barriers? Samuel saw the realization in Eleanor's eyes, and for the first time, he did not turn away, his silence finally breaking under the weight of her shared understanding. He showed her how to read the patterns, how a slightly delayed strike or a missed beat could signify a date, a name, or a price. It was a dangerous game they were playing, turning the tools of the powerful against them in a silent revolution of gears and springs. They spent hours in the dim light, two figures huddled over a workbench, their shadows merging as they decoded the history of a town's betrayal. It is a peculiar irony that the most honest man in the village was the one who had become the repository for everyone else's lies. The atmosphere in the shop shifted from one of isolation to one of shared purpose, the tension between them tightening like a mainspring wound to its limit. Eleanor felt a surge of adrenaline, her intellect finally finding a worthy challenge in the complex web Samuel had woven. She knew that her father was at the center of this web, a realization that brought a sharp, cold pain to her heart, even as it fueled her resolve. They were no longer just a clockmaker and a lady. They were conspirators in a quest for justice, bound by a secret that could end their lives. The danger was palpable, a presence that sat in the corners of the room, watching them with the unblinking eyes of 100 clock faces. As they worked, the world outside continued its oblivious march, the factory whistles blowing and the carriages rattling over the cobblestones. They were an island of truth in a sea of deception, their only weapon the very time that the magistrate sought to monopolize. Samuel's hands, once so steady, trembled slightly as he handed her a small gear etched with the final piece of the puzzle. They knew that once this message was fully understood, there would be no turning back, no returning to the quiet lives they had known before. The clock on the wall struck the hour, with a resonance that felt like a bell of judgment, echoing through the empty streets and into the heart of the coming storm. The sensation of being watched became a constant companion, a cold shadow that followed Eleanor through the narrow, winding streets and lingered outside the clock shop. Every creak of a floorboard and every sudden rustle of the wind felt like a threat, a reminder that their secret was no longer entirely theirs. The vigilance they practiced was exhausting, a mental strain that sharpened their senses but frayed their nerves until every ticking clock sounded like a heartbeat. Samuel moved with a new kind of caution, his eyes constantly darting toward the door, his ears tuned to the sound of footsteps that didn't belong to the rhythm of the neighborhood. Fear is a powerful architect, building walls where none existed and turning even the most familiar faces into potential enemies. The magistrate had begun to grow suspicious of his daughter's frequent disappearances, his gaze turning from one of paternal indulgence to a sharp, cold scrutiny. Eleanor felt the weight of his eyes upon her at the dinner table, the silence between them filled with the unspoken questions of a man who sensed his control was slipping. She had to maintain the mask of the dutiful daughter, her heart racing beneath her silk bodice as she navigated the treacherous waters of her father's house. The timing of their every move was critical, for a single mistake could lead to the gallows for Samuel and a life of ruin for herself. Who hasn't felt the sudden, chilling realization that the person they trust the most might be the very one they should fear? They met in the dead of night, the shop a cocoon of shadows where the only light came from a single, guttering candle that cast long, flickering ghosts against the walls. Samuel spoke of the men who had visited him in the past, men with cold eyes and heavy purses who demanded his silence as much as his skill. He had been a prisoner of his own talent, trapped in a cycle of creating the very tools that were used to oppress the people he lived among. The danger was no longer an abstract concept, but a physical presence, a tightening noose that threatened to choke the life out of their burgeoning alliance. They were operating in the margins of a world that didn't want them to exist, their every breath a defiance of the powers that be. Samuel's vigilance extended to the clocks themselves, as he began to dismantle the most incriminating pieces, his fingers moving with a frantic, desperate speed. He knew that the magistrate's men would eventually come searching, and he wanted to ensure that the evidence was hidden in plain sight, scattered among the hundreds of parts. Eleanor helped him, her smaller hands reaching into the delicate interiors of the machines, her touch a grounding force for the aging man. They worked in a silence that was thick with the scent of old metal and the looming threat of discovery, their bond forged in the fire of shared peril. The irony of their situation was not lost on them. They were trying to save the future by dismantling the past, one gear at a time. As the first light of dawn began to gray the sky, a heavy knock sounded on the front door, the sound echoing through the shop like a gunshot. They froze, their breath held in their lungs, the ticking of the clock suddenly deafening in the absolute stillness of the room. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated terror, the kind that strips away all pretenses and leaves only the raw instinct for survival. Samuel placed a hand on Eleanor's arm, his grip firm and steadying, a silent promise that he would not let her face this alone. The knock came again, louder this time, accompanied by a voice that Eleanor recognized all too well, signaling that the hunt had finally begun in earnest. If the shadows of this industrial mystery are captivating you, please subscribe, like, and share if you want more stories like this. Your engagement is the fuel that keeps our narrative fires burning bright against the darkness. The identity of the true conspirator was revealed not through a grand gesture, but in the subtle way a specific signature appeared on the most incriminating clock movements. It was not just Eleanor's father, but a shadow cabinet of the town's most respected figures, men who had built their empires on the backs of the very people they were sworn to protect. The revelation brought a clarity that was as painful as it was necessary, stripping away the last of Eleanor's illusions about the world she inhabited. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste, a metallic tang that seemed to emanate from the very brass they were handling. They realized that the code was not just a record of past sins, but a plan for a future catastrophe, a calculated manipulation of the town's resources that would leave the poor in even deeper despair. The stakes had risen from personal safety to the survival of the community itself, placing a burden on their shoulders that neither had ever asked for. Every revelation felt like a blow, a reminder of the depths to which men would sink in the pursuit of power and wealth. It is a universal truth that those who scream the loudest about order are often the ones most invested in the chaos they secretly create. The confrontation with the truth forced a transformation in both Samuel and Eleanor, their individual desires for peace and knowledge merging into a singular, desperate need for justice. Samuel found a strength he thought had long since withered, his hands regaining the steadiness of his youth as he prepared for the final stage of their plan. Eleanor's intellect became a weapon, her ability to see the connections between disparate facts allowing them to stay one step ahead of the magistrate's men. They were no longer victims of their circumstances, but architects of their own fate, working together to dismantle the machinery of corruption. It was a moment of profound humanity, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the light of truth can still be found. The shop had become a war room, the walls lined with the blueprints of a conspiracy and the fragments of the clocks that held the key to its destruction. They moved with a synchronized urgency, their actions dictated by the relentless ticking of the clocks that now seemed to count down to a final, inevitable clash. The air was heavy with the smell of old paper and the sharp scent of ozone, a premonition of the electrical storm that was brewing both inside and outside the shop. They knew that the conspirators would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, and that their own lives were now the smallest pieces in a much larger game. The realization brought a grim determination to their faces, a refusal to be silenced by the weight of the power they were opposing. As they finalized the last of the evidence, a sudden silence fell over the shop. The ticking of the clocks momentarily synchronized in a way that felt like a cosmic sigh. They looked at each other, the weight of their journey reflected in their tired eyes. And for a brief second, the world outside ceased to exist. It was a moment of pure connection, a shared recognition of the cost of their choices and the beauty of the truth they had uncovered. But the silence was short-lived, broken by the sound of breaking glass and the heavy thud of boots on the street outside. They were out of time, and the final hour was approaching with a velocity that neither was fully prepared to meet. The final clock was not a grand, ornate piece, but a simple, unadorned mechanism that Samuel had kept hidden in the deepest recesses of his workshop. It was the master key, the one piece that tied all the others together and held the final, undeniable proof of the conspiracy's ultimate goal. When Eleanor saw it, she felt a sense of profound urgency, a realization that this was the message that could either save the town or lead to their immediate execution. The consequence of their discovery was now fully visible, a weight that threatened to crush the very hope they had been clinging to. The choice was no longer whether to act, but how to ensure the message reached those who could still make a difference. The message contained within the final clock was a blueprint for a controlled disaster, a way for the magistrates to seize total control of the town's infrastructure under the guise of an industrial accident. It was a cold, calculated plan that saw human lives as nothing more than expendable parts in a grander design for profit. The revelation was a turning point, a moment where the personal stakes became a public duty that neither Samuel nor Eleanor could turn away from. They felt the urgency in the very air they breathed, a frantic pulse that mirrored the rapid ticking of the master clock. How much is a single life worth When compared to the preservation of a system designed to exploit the many, they had to make a choice, a decision that would determine the course of their lives and the future of the town they both, in their own ways, loved. Samuel wanted to destroy the clock and run, to take Eleanor and find a place where the shadows of the past couldn't reach them. But he knew the truth would only follow them. Eleanor, fueled by a sense of justice she had inherited from the very man she was now opposing, insisted that the message must be revealed, no matter the cost to themselves. Their argument was a silent battle of wills, fought with glances and the frantic movement of their hands as they prepared for the coming confrontation. It was a moment of profound tension, a realization that their bond was being tested in the most brutal way possible. The master clock seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its ticking a constant reminder of the seconds they were losing to indecision and fear. They were surrounded by the ghosts of their own history, the hundreds of clocks that Samuel had created now serving as silent witnesses to their struggle. Every choice they made felt like a gear turning in a mechanism they could no longer stop, a sequence of events that was leading toward an inevitable climax. They were caught in the gears of a destiny that was larger than both of them, a realization that brought a strange kind of peace, even in the midst of the chaos. The time for hiding was over, and the time for action had finally arrived, signaled by the final, resonant strike of the master clock. As they moved toward the door, the final piece of the puzzle in hand, they felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a sense that the world was holding its breath. The street outside was unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of the town muffled by a thick, heavy fog that had rolled in from the river. They knew that the magistrate's men were waiting for them, hidden in the shadows of the narrow alleys, ready to silence the truth before it could ever be spoken. They took a final look at the workshop, the place that had been Samuel's sanctuary and Eleanor's school, and stepped out into the cold, damp air. The journey ahead was fraught with danger, but they moved with a clarity of purpose that no amount of fear could ever extinguish. If the climax of this tale is making your heart race, please subscribe, like, and share if you want more stories like this. Your presence in our community is the greatest reward for the stories we tell, and we are honored to share this final hour with you. The confrontation took place in the town square, under the shadow of the great clock tower that Samuel himself had helped maintain for decades. The magistrate stood there, flanked by his men, his face a mask of cold authority that hid the desperation boiling beneath the surface. The risk was total, a final exposure of the truth that would either set them free or end their lives in a public display of power. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands, and began to speak the truth that the clocks had whispered to her in the dark. She did not yell or accuse, but laid out the evidence with the precision of a master clockmaker, each fact a gear that fit perfectly into the next. The townspeople, drawn by the unusual sight, began to gather in the square, their tired faces illuminated by the flickering torches of the magistrate's men. The courage she showed was a beacon, a challenge to the system that had kept them in silence for so long. It is a terrifying thing to stand alone against a wall of authority, but it is even more terrifying to live a life built on a foundation of lies. Samuel stood beside her, his presence a silent testament to the years of labor and the hidden history he had documented in his workshop. He held the master clock, its rhythmic ticking a counterpoint to Eleanor's words, a physical manifestation of the truth they were revealing. The magistrate's men moved to intervene, but the crowd, sensing the shift in power, surged forward to protect the two figures in the center of the square. The tension was at its climax, a moment where the entire world seemed to hang in the balance, waiting for the final gear to click into place. The risk of violence was real, a palpable energy that crackled in the air like static before a lightning strike. The magistrate's face crumbled, the weight of the evidence and the sudden defiance of the townspeople shattering his facade of control. He realized that the time of his authority had come to an end, that the very people he had sought to manipulate were now the ones holding the power of judgment. It was a moment of profound exposure, a public stripping away of the lies that had sustained the town's elite for generations. The truth was out, a living thing that could no longer be contained or ignored, vibrating through the hearts of everyone who stood in the square. The victory was not won with weapons, but with the simple, unrelenting power of the honest word and the steady tick of a well-made clock. As the magistrate was led away, a strange silence fell over the square, a moment of collective realization of the transformation that had just taken place. They had stood at the edge of the abyss and chosen to step back, guided by the light of a truth they had uncovered together. Samuel and Eleanor looked at each other, the danger finally passing and leaving behind a profound sense of exhaustion and relief. They were survivors of a storm they had helped create, their lives forever changed by the secrets they had shared and the courage they had found in each other. The final hour had passed, but the echoes of its impact would be felt for generations to come, a reminder that even the smallest gear can change the course of history. The aftermath of the confrontation brought a sense of renewal to the town, a feeling that the air was finally clear of the soot and secrets that had choked it for so long. The factories still ran and the clock still ticked, but there was a new rhythm to the life of the community, one built on a foundation of transparency and mutual respect. Samuel's shop remained, but the doors were now open to the public, a place where people came not just for repairs but to learn the history of the town he had helped save. He was no longer the man of solitude, but a respected elder, his hands still moving with grace as he taught a new generation the art of the interval. Time, it seemed, had a way of healing even the deepest of wounds, if one only gave it the space to breathe. Eleanor found a new role for herself, using her intellect and her father's former resources to rebuild the town's infrastructure in a way that benefited everyone. She remained a constant presence in Samuel's life, their bond having deepened into a quiet, profound affection that didn't need words to be understood. They often sat together in the evening light, watching the sun set over the rooftops, the ticking of the clocks a comforting background to their shared peace. Their journey had been one of becoming, a process of shedding their old selves to reveal the strength and clarity that had always been hidden within. Who among us does not long for a beginning that feels as earned and as beautiful as theirs? The town itself was in a state of constant becoming, a work in progress that reflected the new spirit of its inhabitants. The old systems of power had been dismantled, replaced by a community that understood the value of every individual part in the grander design. There was a sense of freedom that had been missing for decades, a lightness of being that allowed people to look toward the future with hope rather than fear. The clockmaker's secret was no longer a burden, but a lesson, a reminder that the truth is the only thing that can truly keep us on time. It was a transformation that was as silent as it was profound, a shifting of gears that changed the entire direction of the town's destiny. Samuel often thought back to the days of his isolation, marveling at how a single encounter could have unraveled the fortress he had built around his heart. He realized that his clocks were more than just tools for measuring time. They were instruments of connection, ways to bridge the gap between the internal and the external worlds. He felt a sense of profound gratitude for the woman who had walked into his shop and changed everything. Her curiosity a spark that had reignited his own passion for life. They were two parts of a whole, a balance of intellect and craft that had created something far more valuable than any clock he had ever made. The story of their lives was no longer a secret, but a shared history that belonged to everyone. As the moon rose over the quiet streets, the rhythmic pulse of the town continued, a steady heartbeat that promised a future of endless possibility. The clocks in the shop ticked in a perfect, harmonious unison, a symphony of time that celebrated the renewal of a world that had almost forgotten how to hope. There was no true conclusion to their story, only a continuous turning of the gears, a prepared hook for the next chapter in the lives of those who had learned to master their own time. They stood together at the window, looking out at the world they had helped rebuild, waiting for the first light of a new day to reveal what else they might become.